Hello and welcome back to another historical video. This time it's about the Battle of Tannenberg. The Battle of Tannenberg is a battle in the First World War on the Eastern Front, and the belligerents were the German Empire with commanders like Paul von Hindenburg, Erich Ludendorff, Max Hoffmann and Commander von Prittwitz. The other side was the Russian army with the commanders Alexander Samsonov and Paul von Rennkampf. And if you think that Paul von Rennkampf sounds very German, you are right. This man was a Baltic German who was serving in the Russian Imperial Army because the Baltic states were part of the Russian Empire back then. The Germans had the 8th Army with a strength of about 150,000 strong, and the Russians had the 1st and the 2nd Army with a combined strength of about 230,000 strong. And the battle was being fought in the forests that you can see right here, and also the environment was of a large influence on the battle. More about that later. So, what happened in the prelude to this battle? In 1871, Germany was created as a new country. It was unified. The former states of Prussia, Saxony and Bavaria and others had united under an emperor, with the Prussian king Wilhelm I as the new German emperor. This new power in Central Europe made both France and Russia uneasy. It had the fastest growing population of the continent, and it also had the largest industry in Europe, especially when it came to the production of steel and railroads. France and Russia had a natural advantage in the case of a conflict with the new state. France was bordering it to the west and Russia to the east, forcing Germany to fight a two-front war if a conflict would break out. This natural advantage had led France and Russia to sign a military convention in 1892. This convention was an agreement between the two countries to come to each other's aid in the case of an attack by Germany or its allies. The agreement took advantage of this two-front circumstance by obligating France to immediately commit 1.3 million soldiers to the western border and Russia to 800,000 soldiers to the eastern border of Germany. The German counter to this was the famous von Schlieffen Plan. This plan had the miscalculation that the Russians would take 6 weeks to arrive because they wouldn't have a fully functioning railroad network. In fact, the Russians arrived within 2 weeks, because between the making of the plan in about 1905 and its execution in 1914, several railroads had been constructed in Russia. The Germans on the Eastern Front were facing overwhelming odds of 8-1, because the numbers that I mentioned earlier, they were the final numbers, and the Russians had their numbers quicker on the front than the Germans. To ease the pressure on France, the Russian commander-in-chief, Grand Duke Nicholas, cousin of the Tsar Nicholas II, had urged his 1st and 2nd armies to invade East Prussia before they had achieved full readiness. Because the Russians... Because the Russians had more than a 2-1 superiority, a combined attack had every chance of destroying the Germans between the two armies. The man who was mostly responsible for the very bad execution of this plan was also responsible for the disastrous invasions being made, and being made before Russian forces were ready. This was General Yakov Grigorievich Zhilinsky, who, as the chief of the General Staff until early 1914, had made the military convention with France, whereby Russia had pledged the 800,000 men in the field by the 15th day of mobilization. This arrangement overwhelmed the cumbrous Russian war machine, which caused numerous cracks and local failures when it began moving. It also put a strain on the Russian headquarters staff, which consequently made decisions in a state of nervous flurry. Zieliński's pledge to the French did not end with this promise, for the plan also envisaged an offensive against the Germans, simultaneously with the main thrust against the Austrians. So Zieliński was planning a superb effort for the Russian army, and that army was totally not ready for it. Along the land frontier, two Russian armies had been assembled. The first, or the Vilna army, 6.5 infantry divisions and 5 cavalry divisions, under General Paul von Rennenkampf, and the second, or the Warsaw army, under General Alexander Samsonov. They were having 10 infantry divisions and 3 cavalry divisions. The two armies formed a group under the higher control of Zieliński. Zieliński's plan was that Rennenkampf should advance against East Prussia from the east, drawing upon himself the German defending forces, and then, 2 days later, Samsonov was to cross the German province's southern frontier and fight against the Germans' rear, cutting them off from the Vistula. This was a classic pincer movement, and it would envelop the Germans if it would have been successful. This kind of pincer movement later became infamous when the Germans again fought against the Russians in the Second World War. The fault of this plan lay not in the conception but in the execution. Its potential value was well proved by the alarm caused in the German headquarters when the menace was disclosed. However, it suffered two natural handicaps, apart from faulty leaderships and military unreadiness. The first was that the two armies were separated by the 80-kilometer chain of the Masurian Lakes in southern East Prussia. And those Masurian Lakes, we can see them here. In the lower part of the map you see these dark areas, and they are supposed to represent the Masurian Lakes. So I'm looking at the Masurian Lake right now. In conjunction with the fortified Königsberg area, which is now Kaliningrad, a part of Russia, on the west narrowed Rennenkampf's line of advance to a gap only about 64 kilometers wide. Second, the Russians' own invasion from the south was now to be handicapped by the fact that they had left the border country a desert, with poor railways and worse roads as a barrier against the German invasion. So they had been destroying all means of infrastructure so that the Germans could not advance into Russia, but now that they were on the attack, it was hampering their own movement. The whole plan of the Russians began well at Gumbinnen on the 20th of August, when Rennenkampf's first army defeated 8 divisions of the German 8th Army on its eastern front. By this time, Samsonov's forces had crossed the southern frontier of East Prussia to threaten the German rear, defended by only 3 divisions. Local commander Prittwitz saw this defeat, and he now wanted to retreat to the Vistula in order to regroup and not suffer further casualties. And there was a bit of a debate in the German headquarters, and because not everybody wanted to retreat, some of the commanders wanted to attack and put pressure on the Russians. It was decided that to gain time and room, an attack should be launched against Samsonov's left, or western flank. For this purpose, 3 divisions should be railed back from the Gumbinnen area to reinforce the 20 Corps, while the remainder of the force there, the 1st Reserve Corps and General August von Mackensen's 17 Corps, were to retreat westward by road. This disposition of forces would be the foundation of the Tannenberg maneuver. On returning to the office, Prittwitz agreed to their moves and spoke no more of retiring behind the Vistula, thereby ending the debate. The next day he grew quite cheerful when word came that his forces had been disengaged safely from Rennenkampf's front and that Samsonov had almost come to a standstill. On August the 22nd, when the German 8th Army headquarters had been moved north to Mühlhausen, a telegram which announced that a special train was on its way with a new commander-in-chief for the 8th Army, Paul von Hindenburg, had arrived. Accompanying von Hindenburg as his chief of staff was the hero of the Liège attack in the west, Erich Ludendorff. The 1st Corps, commanded by Hermann von François of the German 8th Army, was ordered to attack the Russian army. At first François protested because he didn't have enough ammunition yet, but the German commanders were so hell-bent on this attack that they said, well, if you don't have enough ammunition, just attack by a bayonet charge, which is quite suicidal if you think about it. But von François of the German 8th Army broke a Russian line in a frontal attack. The Russians suffered 3,000 casualties and had 5,000 more captured, nearly the whole of the Russian 105th Regiment. Von François pursued the broken defenders until he came under artillery fire. He then retreated to the rest of the 8th Army at their defensive position around the town of Gumbinnen. On the map here there is no such thing as a town. There are only some scattered buildings, but in the Russian base there's a group of field guns, which are the supposed Russian artillery. Let's see if we can take a look. How far can we go on this map before we get executed as traitors? I think we can see them from here. We can't see the gun, but we can see the position. It's over there, the Russian artillery. Okay, so von François achieved a small victory, and this emboldened the Germans, and when the Russian First Army arrived at the town of Gumbinnen, the Germans went on the offensive. Von François' First Corps was successful once again, but other commanders were not so fortunate. The German right flank was broken and fled. The sight of retreating German soldiers petrified Prittwitz. Try to say petrified Prittwitz very fast, 20 times, who knew that even the smallest misstep could mean the Russians capturing Berlin, so he retired deeper into Germany. The calculated daring of the Tannenberg plan owed much to an earlier experience of Hoffmann. He had been present as an observer with the Japanese forces in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. There, Hoffmann learned much about the Russian army, not least that two generals, Rennenkampf and Samsonov, represented two dueling factions within the upper levels of command. Thus, according to Hoffmann, Rennenkampf would be in no hurry to aid Samsonov by pressing on from Gumbinnen. He had also learned in Manchuria the incredible carelessness of Russian communication methods. This knowledge led him, in August 1914, to accept intercepted Russian wireless orders sent out in clear as authentic, whereas his seniors were distrustfully inclined to regard them as an artful deception. By telephone with headquarters, the Germans were reassured that Rennenkampf's army was moving, but very slowly. His heavy wagons were sinking in the sands of East Prussia. They knew about Samsonov's proposed movements from a wireless intercept that agreed perfectly with papers found on the body of a Russian officer killed at Gumbinnen. Now Ludendorff began to think that he could use Mackensen's 17th Corps as an extra force, so leaving only the cavalry to watch and occupy Rennenkampf. Thereby he might strike hard, not at one, but at both of Samsonov's flanks, and bring off a decisive double envelopment. Samsonov, in the meantime, had been staggering forward, driven on by telegraphic lashes from Zielinski, who had jumped to the conclusion that the Germans were doing what Prittwitz had contemplated, retreating to the Vistula. In driving Samsonov on to cut them off, Zielinski not only neglected to hasten Rennenkampf, but even diverted his energy by orders to invest Königsberg. Meanwhile, Samsonov's army was spread out over a front of nearly 100 kilometers, and his right, center, and left were widely separated. If they had been linked by mobility, this width might have been an advantage, but with sluggish troops and bad roads, it became a danger. As you might have noticed on the map here, there are no real roads, only these sunken roads on the sides, like this one here. And you might imagine that a large army passing through will not have a great speed. You can also see a downed plane over here. Planes didn't really play any role in the Tannenberg battle, not a very big one at least. And reconnaissance, the most important role of planes in the First World War, was next to impossible in this heavily forested area. Hindenburg left a small detachment of forces to make it appear to Rennenkampf he was facing the entire German 8th Army, when actually Hindenburg was moving nearly the whole army to surprise and flank Samsonov. The German First Corps, commanded by von Francois, moved from the most northern position to the most southern in the area, and he ended up just on the left flank of the Russian Second Army. This was a highly risky maneuver, for if Rennenkampf had decided to attack, there would be little to no resistance, and he would find himself in the path of Berlin with no opposition. The densely forested area allowed Hindenburg to hide his massive troop movements from Samsonov, while frequent skirmishes in the restricting terrain inhibited any speedy advances by the Russian Second Army. Utilizing the terrain and his superior rail network, Hindenburg positioned his troops in an arc formation around Samsonov in an attempt to envelop his army and rout it. The real crisis of the battle as a whole came on August the 27th, when the main battle was already going on for 2 days, because it had started on the 26th, and the prelude to the battle at Gumbinnen had started on the 20th. That morning, Francois, now amply supplied with shells, opened a fierce bombardment on the position of the Russian left wing near Uzdal. The demoralized Russian troops broke in flight without waiting for the German infantry. And you can see here Russian cavalry units, dead horse and a Russian soldier, because through this road, here is portrayed the broken Russian line and the retreating armies. So, Francois ordered a pursuit to be made toward Neidenburg to get across the rear of the Russian center, but a Russian counterattack against his outer flank caused him to wheel south towards Soldau. At daybreak on August 28, however, discovering that the beaten Russian left wing had retired precipitately from Soldau across the frontier, Francois once more turned his forces eastward toward Neidenburg. By the night of August 29, Francois troops held the road from Neidenburg to Willenberg, with a chain of entrenched posts between. This formed a barricade across the line of retreat of the Russians, who were now flowing back and becoming inextricably mixed in the forest maze, which Francois had avoided. The enveloping maneuver was so successful that the Russian Second Army was completely disintegrated. By the end of the Battle of Tannenberg, 92,000 Russian soldiers were captured, over 75,000 soldiers were killed or wounded, and only around 10,000 soldiers were able to escape. The Germans suffered 12,000 casualties. Oh, I'm a coward according to the game. So, I will return, so the game will know that I'm not a coward. Okay, so after this crushing defeat, Samsonov drew the conclusion that he didn't want to live with bearing the knowledge of this defeat, so he went into the forest and he shot himself on August the 30th. This Battle of Tannenberg was for the Germans a major victory, but far from decisive. And it wasn't decisive because the Russian army, the first Russian army, was still in East Prussia. This set the stage for the next battle in the area, and the next battle in the area was the first battle of the Masurian Lakes, the lakes that played such a huge role in dividing the Russian forces and therefore enabling the German success in the Battle of Tannenberg. The Battle of the Masurian Lakes was fought between the Russian army, the first Russian army, and the reinforced German 8th Army. And Rennenkampf retreated hastily back over the pre-war border before they could be encircled. He had learned from Tannenberg that he should not try and dive too deep into enemy territory. As a result of these East Prussian battles, Russia had lost 250,000 men and, what was even worse for them, a lot of war material. The invasion of East Prussia had, at least by causing the dispatch of 2 corps of the Germans from the west, helped to make possible the French comeback on the Marne. So while this was a heavy defeat for the Russians, at least they helped their ally and caused the First World War to have a static front on the west and a mobile front in the east. So, well, that's it for this video. If you have any additional information about the Battle of Tannenberg that you would like to share, or if you have any questions, please post them in the comments. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.